Welcome to our first in our parent backpack series. This one is entitled, Hey, What Did You Say? Taking a deeper dive into your child's IEP. We are the Family Support Center. My name is Marcy Torshin, and I am a program coordinator in the Family Support Center. With me tonight is Dr. Beth Jayate, who is the instructional specialist in our office for parent engagement, as well as Yvette Young, who is our social worker in our Family Support Center. And you'll hear more from them as well as the evening goes on. So we always like to thank our Prince George's County Board of Education for all of their support, and Dr. Monica Golson, who is our CEO, Chief Executive Officer, for support in all of our activities. As I said before, we are the Family Support Center. This is our, we call it our Bitmoji office. It has lots of clickable links in there that we will send this out once we finish the presentation and send the slides. It will tell you our mission. We have resources. It'll tell you all of the workshops that we're going to offer in addition to a calendar that lists those workshops. Our website also has a workshop calendar on it. We also have consultations that we do for IEP information that can be follow-ups to what we have in the presentation tonight. I am going to put a link in the presentation. It was also in your email notification today, and that link will take you to a blank IEP, just in case you have something that you want to follow along with us this evening. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Miss Young, who is going to get us started tonight.
So sorry, it would help if I took myself off of mute. Good evening, everyone, and we are very excited for you to be here with us tonight. We know that your time is very precious, and we're just excited that you took time out to participate in this session this evening. We're excited to share this first presentation of a 4-part series, Parent Backpack for Success. This series is designed to help you set your student up for academic, social, and emotional success while maintaining your energy reserves, particularly regarding navigating this whole IEP process. Tonight's session is going to focus on unraveling the IEP document itself. The next sessions in November, we're going to look at organizing for the IEP meeting. In January, we're going to talk about tips and tricks for supporting your child's learning without a fight. Who doesn't want to know that? And in February, data. We're going to talk about understanding data and how data is used to determine your child's progress. The goals for tonight are to review the purpose of the IEP, increase understanding about the various sections of the IEP, and help you feel more comfortable with the IEP process as we go along. This is an overview. So we're going to spend some more time on some slides, less time on other slides, and other slides we're just going to briefly gloss over. But first, let's do a brief check-in. It's a small group tonight, so feel free to unmute yourself or just share your answers in the chat. When you think about this IEP document, what thought comes to mind? And please put any or all numbers that might apply. When you think about your child's IEP, is it 1? It's a very comprehensive document. Is it 2? Oh no, it's lots of information. Is it 3? It's an accurate reflection of my child's needs. Is it 4? It doesn't accurately reflect my child's needs. Or is it number 5? I could use some more help in understanding this document. Choose one or multiples of these prompts. What comes to mind when you think about your child's IEP? And again, please feel free to even unmute and share. Okay, Miss Cunningham says, so 1 and a 3 is very comprehensive and it's an accurate reflection. Good for you of your child's needs. That's awesome. Joni Turner says 1, 2, and 3. It's very comprehensive. It's a lot of information, but it accurately reflects your child's needs. And so, again, I really commend you for, even though you believe that the document reflects your child's needs, you're still here to get an in-depth knowledge about what's supposed to be in the document. And for the sake of time, we're just going to keep moving, but feel free if anybody else wants to share in Espanol or Inglés. We always like to remind ourselves that there's a law to this, right? There's a law, the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, also known for short as IDEA, which requires that each child in public school who receives special education or related services have an individualized education program or an IEP. The law requires that public schools meet the unique needs of all K through 12 students with disabilities, where it impacts their education. And the schools do this by providing services and specially designed instructions. So that's a lot of terminology. If you would like to take a deeper dive into understanding what all of that means in terms of the law, please feel free to give our office a call and we can chat more about that, but we're going to keep going. If you're in this meeting, more than likely you've already been to an IEP meeting. Our goal tonight is to help you understand your rights and what should be contained in the IEP document so you can advocate more effectively for your child at the meeting. Next slide. With regards to the IEP topic tonight, we're going to focus on the who, the what, the when, the where, and the how, and the why of what's supposed to go into the document. Next slide. So we have a little video clip, and this video clip is a mock IEP meeting. As you watch the video clip, we would like you to consider the following. Take note of the following. What was the purpose of the IEP meeting? Who was participating in the meeting? Were any documents offered? And see if you can listen for what was the disability that the child has.
Okay, hi everyone. How are we all doing today? I wanted to do some quick introductions before we start our meeting. So I'll start with myself. I'm Miss Montiel. I'm the special education teacher here at Great School Elementary.
Hello, my name is Miss Castrins and I am the principal and the administrator.
Hi, I'm Miss Bress and I'm David's general education teacher. Nice to meet you all.
Hello, my name is Ms. Vindas and I am the school's speech language pathologist.
Hi there, my name is Lisa Lee. Nice to meet you all.
Great. So the purpose of this meeting today is David's annual meeting. So Mrs. Lee, do you have any questions about your parent rights, or I can email you a copy of the procedural safeguards?
Sure, I will take an additional copy.
Okay, so I'll email that to you over right now. So I want to start with David's strengths, and I'll start. David's such a kind student who really never gives up, and you know, when we're working together, he will continue to try, even if he gets an answer wrong. He really never gives up. Miss Bress, would you like to talk about any of the strengths that you've seen in David?
Yeah, so David's actually been amazing in class. He absolutely loves math and is absolutely thriving in that subject. It's really the subject he's most confident in, and it shows in his work and in his engagement.
Yeah, I agree. David is a pleasure to work with. I have definitely seen areas of improvement when it comes to his speech and language. From his last IEP, David is definitely talking more and using a combination of 3 to 4 words. He can respond hi and bye at the beginning and end of our sessions together. He's been much more engaged in play, which was a big improvement from our last meeting.
Yes, I would also like to add in that I've seen David really grow since when he entered school like kindergarten. I know sometimes he struggles with his communication, but if I ask him about cars when he's waiting in line for class, I end up learning so much from him.
Yes, he can talk for hours about cars. He will look up videos, flip through books about them. I agree with all the teachers on David's strength. He's a sweet boy who always wants to do his best and will always try his best.
So, Mrs. Lee, do you have any concerns for David?
Well, his communication and reading mostly. I have noticed he struggles with comprehending what he's reading, and sometimes he doesn't respond to his name when I call him. I am also concerned with his interaction skill. Our conversation feels very one-sided. I think this may be related to his diagnosis in autism, but I'm not quite sure.
Yes, your observations about his conversational skills are typical for children with autism. His limited eye contact and inconsistent responses to his name are also prominent.
Okay, I understand.
Okay, thank you so much, Marcy. So again, on this little short clip, you can unmute or put in the chat. What do we remember? What did we hear? Does anybody remember or hear what's the purpose of this meeting in this mock IEP meeting? What was the purpose of the meeting? Anybody know? Anybody catch the child's name? David, that's correct. Yes, that's correct. All right, so what was the purpose of David's meeting? I'll go ahead and share for the sake of time. It was David's annual review meeting. That's very good. Yes, David's annual review meeting. Does anybody remember a couple of cast of characters who were at the meeting? What were the labels of the persons identified? An SLP, very good. Yes, a speech and language pathologist. Any other parties that we know, we remember who they were? His teachers, very good. There was his teacher there. Excellent. And does anybody remember, was there any document offered or shared? I really appreciate people's participation. It's exciting. Procedural safeguards or procedural rights, very good. And if you didn't catch it, the disability was, anybody remember? Autism. Excellent. Thank you very much. So the reason why we are going through the video is because in real meetings, it's probably similar to this. They are not necessarily going page by page of the document like we're going to go through tonight. They may not even go in the same order that the document that you have in your hand. But it's important for you. That's why it's important for you to receive the document in advance, so you'll be able to know what's contained in each section and have your questions available in advance. And also, just a note, in Maryland now, parents are supposed to be offered the habilitation guide document as well. Next slide, please. So at the meeting, these are the persons who are the minimum number of persons that should be at the meeting: the parent or guardian or this parent surrogate, not less than one special education teacher, not less than one general education teacher, a representative of the local school or local school system, an individual to interpret evaluation results if that's part of the meeting. And then there are other additional at the discretion of the parent or the local school system. And again, if appropriate, the student could attend. And we always say that 14 students should be invited to the meeting, but if it's appropriate for younger kids, even younger kids could benefit from being at the meeting. Next slide, please. So this weighty, comprehensive document of 20 and 30 pages has some structure and order to it. So your child's IEP is divided into 6 sections. We're going to talk more about that as time goes on. Did I miss a comment? Okay, good to know. All right. So yes, it's divided into 6 sections. We're going to talk about each of these 6 sections. We have some pages to transition between the sections just to help you orient yourself to the different parts of the IEP. Next slide. All right, here we go. Page number 1. Page number 1 is the student's identifying information. It's the name, the grade, the parent's information, the address, and you probably often hear them ask you if this information is accurate. First of all, the name of the parent tells the school team who are they supposed to be engaging with in terms of scheduling the meeting and reviewing this IEP document. The phone number and address is important for them to review because sometimes people change, they move, they change phone numbers and so forth, or email addresses. And so all of that identifying information is very important to make sure it's accurate on that first page. Other information that's of note: English language learners. It's noted here if a student is an English language learner. That's important. There's important dates of what's the date of the meeting, when is the reevaluation date, so that you'll know, are we on track with the schedule that we're supposed to be having the meetings on? And then, is this the native language of the parent, or does the parent need a translation or translator? And most importantly, the disability. At the bottom is indicating what is the child's disability that qualifies the child for an IEP. All right, next slide, please. So section number 1, meeting and identifying information. All right, on this page is divided into 2 sections. The top portion of the information is for students receiving an IEP for the first time or their initial eligibility, while the bottom portion is for continued eligibility. As you probably know, the school team must meet to determine if a student continues to be eligible or meets criteria for having special education services. And they have to determine if the eligibility is still appropriate at least every 3 years. And as part of that process, they also determine if any new evaluations are needed. So that's what you'll find on the bottom. And again, it will note what is the disability that's impacting the child's education, why they need an IEP. At the end of this presentation is going to be resources that you can use to look up more details about the various disability categories. Next slide. The team must also discuss what's the exit plan. Eventually, everybody's going to leave school. What's the plan? Is it a high school diploma or is it a certificate of completion? And then what's the date that we expect that this will take place, that the student will complete this plan, whichever the plan is. Here is indicated if the student will be participating in statewide assessments, or if the student will be participating in alternate assessments. And again, we'll be having other discussions that will talk about that in more detail, or you can call our office if you would like to know the difference. But I will tell you that if the student is being evaluated through alternate assessment track, this parent has to at least be asked if they agree. And then there's a prompt at the bottom, a direct prompt to say, is the student on a high school diploma or a certificate track? Next slide. And my colleagues can feel free to add any information if I am overlooking anything. So finally, for this section, okay, go ahead. Go back, Marcy, go ahead.
I was just going to say these decisions, like everything else in the IEP, are made annually, even the alternate assessment and the exit plan. You could have a student who is learning on the alternate standards and learning on through the alternate assessment, but progress is made. And then the next year when you revisit that decision, then it could be that the student is now pursuing a high school diploma. So just know that when you make that decision or you give permission, if that's something that your child is doing, that it's not a final decision that will carry with them all through their schooling years.
Okay, great. And then the last page of section 1 of the IEP is for specific assessments. There are specific assessments for English language learners. So if your student is an English language learner, then that information will be captured at the top of this page, and the scores for those assessments would be also listed at the top of this page. The rest of the page would contain information about scores if the student has already taken statewide assessments. Marcy, anything else you want to say about this page?
No, I think we're good there. Just that it's basically a historical record of the scores that your child gets on the assessment. And that's important moving forward to look when they get to the high school level, so you know what credits they've learned and what scores they've gotten.
Okay, now I'll turn it over. The next section is going to be covered by our esteemed colleague, Dr. Beth Jente.
Hello. So the next topic, or the next section of the IEP, is the present level of academic achievement and functional performance. And basically, this is the part of the IEP that discusses the various assessments that were used with your child, information from the teachers, and what their current academic achievement is and their instructional level. This should also be reviewed annually, and the data should be accurate. So if you're looking at this document and if you see information there from 3 years ago, it's not a present level. The present level should tell you where your child is currently functioning during that year-long period of the current IEP. Next. So here is a copy of what the next section looks like. And so basically, when you get to the present levels, you'll see different domains. You'll see academic. So does your child have a need in math or reading? You'll see physical. You see behavioral. And when you're looking at these domains, you need to look for several key factors. So one, they should identify the area. So for this one, it's math problem solving. They should identify the source of the information. How did they find out what the present level currently is? In this example, they used iReady diagnostic assessments, Wilcox-Johnson test of achievement, and the assumption will be they use the math scores, and then let's say the teacher or an outside provider went in and did a classroom observation. In addition to listing the sources and the dates that those assessments were conducted, they should also have a summary of those findings. Okay, so based on all of those sources, what is your child currently working on? What are his strengths? What are his weaknesses or areas of need? And then you'll also see on the opposite side trend data. So they must also include where your child has been performing over the past couple years. So for example, if your child is currently in 7th grade this year, you should see on their IEP where they were performing in 6th grade as well as 5th grade. And if that's not there, that's something that I would ask the team about. So when you look at this area, one area that I always tell parents to look at is this last statement where there's an arrow. It says, does this area impact the student's academic achievement and or functional performance? So is it an area of impact? And if it says yes, then when you go to the goal section, which we'll discuss a little later on, you should see a goal. So the example here is math problem solving. So when I look at this child's IEP, the first thing I'm going to do when I go to the goals section is make sure that the team has identified goals in math problem solving. Does anyone have any questions? Okay. So on the next slide, I'm going to give an example of a present level of performance. And I want you to pay close attention based on those areas that we just discussed. And I want you to tell me, do you think this is a good representation of the present levels of performance? Marcy, can you flip back one? Just so that we can go over those areas again quickly. So, is the area identified? Are the sources of information listed? Is the date of those sources identified? Are the dates identified? Is there a summary? Do we have 2 years of previous data? And is the instructional level indicated in the area of impact? And we'll go over that again because we know it's a lot. Okay. So this is a math problem solving. Gary is a 7th grader who's currently performing on a 3rd grade level in math problem solving. Marcy, you can bring the whole thing up. He took an iReady diagnostic assessment. He had an informal classroom assessments. He had an observation and Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement as of September 23rd. He can solve for a variable when completing an addition or subtraction equation. And Gary can solve word problems that involve money, specifically how much change he should be received when making purchases of up to $10. Next. So based on this observation, do you think all of those areas were covered previously? Or do you think something is missing? Would this be enough information if you were reading your child's present level? What do you guys think? Is the area clearly identified, what he's going to be working on? Can you tell me the academic area that we're going to address for this present level? Math. Okay. So is his current instructional level clearly identified? What is the current instructional level in math? What's the current grade level? Third grade. And did they identify when each of the assessments were conducted? That's a yes or no. Do you think it's clear when each of the assessments? That's correct. And did they tell you whether or not this is an area of impact? Right, as of, did they tell you whether or not this is an area of impact for Gary? So I'll tell you the answer to that is no. And so if we go to the goals and objectives and we see that he does have a goal there, then there's a disconnect. Because if it's an area of impact, it should be indicated as a yes, and there should be a goal. If it's not an area of impact, then it should not be listed as a goal. All right, thanks. Next slide. So the new area that has been listed on the IEP, I think it's effective July 2020, is a present level of academic achievement and functional performance for secondary transition. And as Yvette mentioned earlier, secondary transition activities appear on your child's IEP the year that they turn 14. And there are different areas that they can select here. And for the purpose of this presentation, we have selected the second radio button that talks about education and training. So just as they are required to put a present level regarding the academic areas, we are now required to put a present level regarding secondary transition. Next. And it looks very similar. We have to tell what the sources are. And for this student, the sources were a student interview, and then they did an official career and life explorer assessment, and they used teacher feedback. The current level of performance was 7th grade. This is a 7th grade student. So they have their summary of assessment, and they talk about the fact that the student completed the assessment and the interview on October 11th, and it was very specific, and they even told who conducted the interview. Then they gathered information about what the student wanted to do in terms of their post-secondary education. He said he wants to go to college, he wants to be a photographer, and he specifically mentioned a four-year college and said he would like to go to University of Maryland. And again, just as the goals and objectives change, next year the student might be in 8th grade and his thoughts of post-secondary education may change, but you should see that reflected in the updated present level. And then they also included a statement from the teacher regarding his strengths. Next. So again, this is the continuation of the present level for secondary transition. And on this example, they use the ONET interest profiler, and they conducted that on January 16th, 2022. And while, you know, some of these assessments, not all these assessments may be used with your child, but we want you to know that they should always give you the source of information and always let you know how your student performed and what that current level of performance is, and a summary of whatever those findings were. Next. So on this section, this is where parents get to provide input into the IEP. Although we would love for you to provide input into all aspects, including the goals and objectives, accommodations, modifications, supplementary aids, and supports. But this is when the team should specifically ask you, how do you feel about your child's educational program? And you can include the academic components, the social, emotional, behavioral, and even what you envision for them post-secondary. And this is where all of this will be documented. Sometimes parents are asked at that IEP meeting, at the annual review, to provide that information. But I also have attended meetings where they prepare a statement and they hand it to the IEP team. They review it at the meeting, but they provide this written document of the information that they want included under the parental input section. I mean, sometimes we have a lot. We know that IEP meetings are sometimes overwhelming. So it's a really good idea to kind of write down those things that you would like to see included in your child's IEP to make sure that it is captured in the parental input section. Has anyone, first of all, do you guys remember being asked for parental input? And if so, did you provide it at that meeting, or did you provide something in writing for the team? Anyone want to share? All right, so again, it's a really good practice to make sure you have that information handy, even if you just jot notes, because the team will ask you, what is your parental input? So Ms. Blyther said, I think I've verbally shared info, but I've never taken time to write something out. Do you think it's something you consider in the future? Yes. Yeah, I think it's a good idea, because sometimes you walk away from the meeting, you're like, oh no, I should have said this. And at least now, here you have all the areas that you can cover. You can cover the academic concerns, or even successes that you've seen with your child, the functional, those practical life skill goals that you want your child to be able to accomplish. What's their social emotional needs like, if there are any behavioral concerns. And when your child is 14 and older, yeah, what are those thoughts about the future? Do you want them to go to college? Do you envision them going to college? Are there any things that we need to include in the IEP in order to help them have access? So it says ours was verbal too. We had a transition IEP from infants and toddlers that occurred in May. So yeah, there's a big jump from infants and toddlers, the IFSP process, to the IEP process. Things look a lot different even in the classroom setting once that transition occurs. So yeah, you really have to stay on top of this document. Make sure that those supports that may not have been needed, as a younger person, they may be needed in the classroom setting. So don't just, take for granted that what was on that initial document is what your child is going to need this year or even next year. And understand that the document is very fluid. So even if a need arises and it's the middle of the year and you're still 4 or 5 months off from your IEP meeting, you still can call a meeting at any time and say, look, we need to take another look at this document. What can we add to provide additional support and access for my child in the school age setting? And I see someone made a comment that they were also transitioning, getting ready to transition from pre-K 4 to kindergarten, and very worried. I mean, it's a big transition. All of our transitions are big for our students with IEPs, but the way that you can stay prepared and help assist with the process is to know everything that's on this document, or know how to access everything that's on the document. Because the thing that's going to be critical is ensuring that all the supports that your child needs to be successful are in place. And the way we do that is making sure that they're including on this document, because everything that's here, we're legally bound to. And if you know that there's something up here that's not occurring, then we need to be held accountable. So the more we can teach you about your rights and responsibilities as a parent and the information that's included in the document, the more accountable we become as a school system. Because if your child needs frequent breaks or extended time or any other accommodation or modification and they're not getting it, then that impacts us as well, right? Because then we're not even able to demonstrate how much they're able to do, how much they know, and what else we need to teach them. All right, so next.
That was the absolute perfect segue into this next section. The next section of the IEP is the special considerations and accommodations. And that's where we talk about the supports that are in place for a student to be successful at any level. So when Beth mentioned earlier that some things had been added to the IEP for transition, they've really expanded the descriptions and the supports with transition services. These supports and statements are designed to help youth with disabilities prepare for life after high school. They are required for all students who are 14 and above, but they can be completed sooner. This new section captures student preferences, interests and skills, education, training, and independent living. It was there before, but it wasn't necessarily as expansive as it has been. So they have to look at the domains of employment, academic, activities of daily living, independent living, and transportation. And there is an additional page for community agency linkages. As your student grows older, after age 14, you start to think about the supports that they're going to need for post-secondary life. And so those can include state and federal agencies, any type of employment assistance, any type of funding. And this helps to plan for searching and exploring employment in the field or completing employment assignments in class. So the next section is still dealing with secondary transition. And this session deals with what that looks like for them. So those interest surveys, those discussions, those assessments that students take in regards to transition, what kind of studies they need in high school to prepare for that, whether they're going to college, community college, post-secondary employment, all of those things, independent living. This looks at what course of study is necessary. It discusses what's needed to support that decision, and then listing the courses that the student is taking to align with their post-secondary goals. And then it adds post-secondary goals. So these are goals within the IEP that are related to transition activities. And again, your student is invited to the meeting starting at that age 14. So the next thing we look at in the IEP is whether or not the student has specific communication needs. So if they have special communication needs, and if they do, what the description of those needs are, and whether the student requires assistive technology. And for the purposes of this meeting, we'll just say that assistive technology spans everything from a grip on a pencil to a voice output device that may help a student communicate. There will be other sessions that get more in depth on what those supports look like, but those supports are documented, as well as whether or not the student receives assistive technology services. Some students have behavioral challenges in school, and that may be attributed to their disability. So there may be what we call a functional behavior assessment or a behavior intervention plan that comes from that functional behavioral assessment. And that behavior intervention plan is really a formalized plan for how to address those behaviors. You'll notice at the bottom that there is documentation of 2 interventions that have been used in the past for interventions for behaviors. One is seclusion, which is leaving a student in the room by him or herself. That is no longer allowed in public schools in the state of Maryland. The other is restraint, and you can either agree or decline to restraints as a behavioral intervention. That is your right as a parent. So accommodations fall within 2 categories, instructional and testing accommodations. And they are provided to support the child towards attaining their annual goals. And they are very student specific. And they are things that give the student access to the general education curriculum, and oftentimes to that general education classroom. One of the things that we tell parents to think about as they enter the high school years is that accommodations, while required by law in the IEP, are not necessarily required to be just given to students once they exit secondary school. It's not an automatic process. So one of the things we tell teams to think about as kids are getting older is how to teach kids how to ask for those accommodations. What works for them? What helps them have access? And so that students are ready to have accommodations. Accommodations are really student specific. You want to make sure that you're looking at the characteristics of the disability and matching that to what accommodation is available in instruction and assessment. So as we look at this next slide, they should be reviewed on a continuing basis, officially on an annual basis, but really should be something that is tried. And if it doesn't work, coming back to the table. It's kind of a living document, if you will, of what the student is able to have for supports. Some common ones are small group, text to speech or human reader, which is a read aloud for students who have difficulty with reading. Another common one is extended time, and we can look a little bit at what they look like on the IEP. So you'll see here, this is a student who has small group instruction. And small group doesn't necessarily mean one-on-one. It doesn't necessarily mean 2-to-1. It just means a smaller group than what is in the classroom that they're currently in. And that is documented as being able to be used. And these pieces of the IEP will also tell you which statewide assessments they can be used on. So you'll see for this one in particular, it can be used across the board for both instruction and assessment. Extended time is a super common accommodation that is for students. It applies to the initial window of time for the assignment to be completed. So in other words, if a student in the general education classroom without an IEP has an hour and it's documented on the IEP that they get time and a half, then it would be an hour and a half for the student. If they have a day and it's time and a half, they would have a day and a half. And so that's really important to think of, that it's what differentiates according to the disability, the time that's needed. So it's not just, oh, I gave the student, all my students an hour when it really should have taken 30 minutes. It's, I gave all the students an hour, and because of my child's disability, he gets an extra half hour because he has time and a half on his IEP. One of the questions I like to tell parents to ask at IEP meetings is, how are you documenting the accommodations? Can you show me how you're providing those accommodations to the student? And that way you can know that the student is being given the accommodations in order to have access to his education. So the next piece is what we call supplementary aids and services. And this outlines what supports the student needs in all areas. Whereas the accommodations change kind of how they're being presented and as far as supports, this really details how instruction is different with the use of those accommodations. So where is it going to happen? So if it's a small group and you've noticed that your child works better in the counselor's office and the school says that's available for the student to use for taking tests, then that's where that would be documented, that specific location. How will it be presented? Sometimes the supplementary aids and services are more about what happens with the teacher than the student herself. So the teacher may be getting an occupational therapy consult, or the teacher may be getting an assistive technology consult in order to better provide that specially designed instruction. It can encompass environmental supports, social behavioral supports. For example, if the student needs a token board for working towards a behavioral goal, all of those things are documented within the supplementary aids and services. And here's just some examples of what can be in the supplementary aids and services. Some of the common ones are picture supports, reducing the number of answer choices. Some common social emotional behavior supports are an additional adult support, homeschool communication systems. And I really want to go back to what Beth said. It's really important that these are documented on the IEP, because as a school system, we're then legally required to provide them. So for example, the communication system, if it is documented on the IEP, then that's what needs to happen. Special considerations, these are some of the more common physical and environmental supports. And again, I talked a little bit about those school personnel and parental supports. So the IEP itself, this is kind of an example of what it would look like. One of the things they can choose is students using manipulatives for math. And the frequency probably is other, because you're not going to say weekly or daily, because it's really only when they need it for math. It will have specific beginning and end dates. Those beginning and end dates are usually the annual review, so that the child gets it across their IEP. And then it's going to tell you who's providing that accommodation or supplementary aid and service. So the next thing, the final thing in the special considerations and accommodations is ESY. And ESY is what's considered extended school year, and it is reviewed on an annual basis. And it is instruction that is given in the month of July for PGCPS. But we need to review all of these specific questions. So it's looking at whether or not your child regresses and takes an extra amount of time to recoup those skills. There are questions about nature of severity of behavior. All of those things that if the child has an extended break, it would provide an opportunity for them to not have a free and appropriate public education. So if that extended break is going to impact them to the point where they're losing skills and regressing more than the typical child would, then the team will discuss whether or not ESY is appropriate. And the one thing I want to say about the ESY discussion is that it needs to happen annually at the IEP meeting. And it is something for which you can provide parental input. And it's something that needs to be discussed each question, and not just told to you whether or not you are going to have ESY services for your student or not. So I'm going to hand it back over to Yvette, and she's going to start talking about kind of the next piece that relates back to the annual goals and the the present level of performance and the accommodations. So Yvette, take it away.
Thanks, Marcy. Marcy gave you the answer. Dividarn, I was going to ask who remembered what the goals section of the IEP is supposed to relate to. So next slide, Marcy told us the present levels of performance. And I mean, I'm a little unique. I love the goals and objectives section of the IEP because it tells us what are we working on? What are we working to accomplish over the course of this year? And so annual goals are established based upon each student's individualized needs, and it's based on data. It's not just that we looking at the curriculum and we're just picking stuff. So the goal for this student is, for each student, is based upon what his or her present level of performance documented need is based on the data that has been collected. And all goals are evaluated and data collected on progress toward mastery every year. And then the goals are broken down into smaller chunks, objectives. And you are supposed to receive progress on these goals and objectives as frequently as non-disabled peers receive their progress or their report cards. And the goals and objectives are supposed to align with grade level education curriculum standards. So your child may need, let's say your child may be reading on a 3rd grade level, but is in 6th grade. Your child would be exposed to that 6th grade level curriculum, and the goals and objectives would align with how we're going to expose that student to that grade level curriculum. And also it's going to cover the Maryland College and Career Readiness Standards as well. All right, so we had a present level. It told us, okay, these are the things that we need to work on. And then we set some goals. So one thing that I want to say from working with a lot of parents going to IEP meetings, if you don't know what that goal is saying, please do not be shy to ask, because a lot of times goals are written in what I like to call technicalese. And if you're not an educator by trade, you might not really know what does that mean when the goal is they're going to, I don't know, I can't even make up something off the top of my head, but I know that there's been lots of times where there's a goal where they're going to be exposed to reading comprehension, and they're going to use inferences. And like, if you are not sure what the child is supposed to be accomplishing with that goal, please ask them to explain it better. And then the objectives are supposed to be related to the goal. How is the student going to accomplish this goal? That's broken down into the smaller objectives. So sometimes it might be the number of trials, or that they're going to give the child to try the goal, or sometimes it might be percentages of success and completion, but they always should loop back to the present levels of performance. If you find something that is in the present levels and you don't see a goal, that is your chance to provide some parental input and ask, hey, what's the goal for this issue or concern that was identified in the present level? And then you're going to receive a progress report on average 4 times a year. And like I said, it's going to align usually with when the student gets their report card. Did I miss anything? Okay, cool. All right, so then there's services. Can you take a guess? What kinds of services might a student be receiving? Or is your child receiving quote unquote services? What are services? You can unmute or you can put in the chat. Is any child receiving services? Or what are some of the services? Speech, okay, that's one. Any other one that you might could think of? OT, occupational therapy. Okay, one more for the good of the order. So next slide, please, Marcy. So services out in the services section of the IEP, it outlines the nature of the services, whether it's going to be physical education, like some students might be receiving adaptive PE or speech and language, or older kids might be receiving travel training and definitely classroom instruction across the board. On that IEP, it's going to document if they are getting services. Of course, it's based upon the need. We already established that. So it's only based upon the need, and it's based upon data that's collected. But if it's determined that there is a need, how many sessions? What's the length of the time, and how frequently per week, per month is this student going to be receiving the services, and who is the provider? So let's take a look at the page. Oh wait, I think we have something else before we get to the actual sheet. All right, so more about related services, excuse me, related services. Related services are developmental, corrective, and other supportive services that are required to assist the child with a disability in order to benefit from special education, right? So related services are identified by the team. It is a team decision. And we haven't talked about other kinds of data that you might provide. Sometimes a parent might provide evaluations from the outside. You have a right to do that. And those evaluations might recommend services, but they have to be, those evaluations have to be evaluated by the team. The team has to accept the results and determine that the child needs those services to be provided by the school system in order to access the educational curriculum. And so related services can cover a whole wide variety of disciplines. So here's some examples. Any services that a child qualifies for is listed on the IEP, and here you'll see the sections where there's the beginning date, the end date, the percentage of participation, the dates of services, the frequency, and there's an additional page listing other options of services. So this one page is not the sum total. The provider could be the special educator or the related service provider. It could be the general education classroom teacher, but you would know who is providing that service. It would be listed right here. And the frequency, like we talked about, is it weekly, monthly, yearly, the number of hours and minutes, so that you could go back to the team, and the team is supposed to be able to provide information on did the child receive these services? And sometimes at the IEP team meeting, the service provider will come in person and share what the progress is, or they may send a statement if they cannot be there in person. Okay, I'm gonna turn it back over. Before I turn it back over, that was a really brief, broad brush overview of goals and objectives. We could actually spend a whole session on that by itself. Whether your child is transitioning from pre-K to kindergarten, that's a really big transition, and it's so important to look at the goals and the objectives. The goals, what I didn't mention, the goals and objectives could be academic, they could be related services, goals and objectives. They could be behavioral goals and objectives. So it's really important for you to look at the categories of goals and objectives. And again, they should be accomplishable in a year's length of time. Any questions about anything that we've covered thus far? I'm going to turn it back over to Marcy to talk about placement.
So one of the last things we talk about in an IEP meeting is placement. Every year, there is the need to determine whether the child is in what we call the least restrictive environment. It is, the law tells us that children with disabilities are to be educated with their typically developing peers as much as possible. It is determined annually. It is based, just like everything else, on that present level of performance, the accommodations, the goal, and it is required to be as close as possible to the child's home. So the child will be educated in the school that he or she would attend if they were non-disabled, as long as the IEP can be implemented. Now, there are times that the IEP cannot be implemented at the home school. For example, if you have a student with a significant cognitive disability that has adaptive needs, orthopedic needs, that cannot be supported at the home school, there might be a different placement for that child where they're receiving instruction in a different PGCPS school. It is always based on the unique needs of the student, and the decision is always made by the IEP team, of which you are a part. It is not based on disability. It is not to say that a student with a specific learning disability goes to one school and a student with another learning disability goes to a different classroom. It's always based on those specific needs of the student. So it tells you how much time the student is getting in general education and how much time they're in a special education setting. Services can be a bunch of things. Service hours are consistent throughout our district. It's a service and not a place. So it can be delivered in the current environment, but it also can be delivered in pull-out in another classroom. It really is a continuum based upon the needs of the student.